Hello? Yes, Chris. Hey, thanks for getting back to me. Wait, what do you mean they're not in stock? It is how long to get them? What? 8 weeks? But just to get a set of wheels? No, really? Man, I was hoping to get these rims next week so I could get the tires mounted. 8 weeks? And that is what happens when you don't do any build planning. Okay, so build planning. Let's talk about that. There's a couple key pieces to build planning, and most people are going to follow some sort of build planning process. The first part of that is understanding what you want to get out of the build. So that's the very first thing you need to do. So if you want to lower the truck and you're starting from a stock ride height, you really got to have an idea in your head of where you want the truck to sit. What's the stance going to look like? Most guys, when they start with a vehicle, pick on the big guys, Chip Foose, Dave Kindig, they do some sort of rendering or sketch or something like that. When you look at that, the key pieces of that is wheels, tires, whatever, and where the body sits relative to that, the stance. Right? They then do, what they want in terms of paint color and what they want in terms of fender flares and whatnot. But getting that stance down is going to drive a lot of decisions for you. It's going to help you decide what you want to do in terms of suspension, etc. Beyond that, when we're talking about the trucks, the popular thing with the C10s is you're either going to bag it or you're going to do a static drop. If you're going to bag it, you need to decide you just want a low stance when you're parked, or do you want to actually lay frame? When you make that decision, that's going to help narrow down a couple of different options that you got in terms of who's making stuff. Chop and block, Porter Pilt, whoever. Static drops, you're going to look at No Limit, you're going to look at Roadster Shop, you're going to look at Ride Tech, etc. Right? So just by making those handful of decisions already kind of limits you down in some of the options that you're going to have to deal with, because right now the market is flooded with the amount of aftermarket upgrades that you can select from for your build. So now the other thing I do is I do a spreadsheet when I'm doing the research. So the first part of the build planning is research. Go do your homework, get all the costs and write those costs down. So what I've done here is I just decided what everything I want to do. And we're actually looking at one of the very early planning sheets that I did for C10 CJ. I basically started out writing down, all right, I know that I have a few things that I want to do at a minimum, and then I started getting into the major stuff. But I wrote it all down. I wrote down everything I wanted to do. Now, one note, I've hidden all the costs because these costs were back in 2015. I want to be fair to those manufacturers because costs have changed, so I don't want you guys to get any ideas from that. So there is cost in this spreadsheet. I've intentionally hid those because these costs are 3 years old, so I don't want to make any sort of implyment on what things cost today, because it is 2019. So this was December 2015. So just keep that in mind. You do need to write down the cost, because what I do is I came up with options. So I started off with writing down all the suspension that I wanted to look at. I wrote down, I had Hotchkiss, Porter-Built coilovers, I had the No Limit chassis, I had the No Limit, just their bolt-on setup, so like their wide ride, and then their new trailing arm kit. The trailing arm kit actually came out after I'd already kind of made the decision, but it was a viable option. We got 2 different Roadster Shop chassis that I looked at, the Revo and the Fast Track. I looked at even a Fast Track with the independent rear suspension. That would have been a kick-ass setup, but that is quite a bit of work. And so forth. And so then I summed all those up. For each one of those chassis options, I looked at what were the relevant other things that needed to go along with that. So I buy a chassis. Do I want a rear end now? Well, yeah, probably, because I wanted to increase the horsepower, right? So when you're increasing the horsepower, unless you want to be broken down on the side of the road, you need to start looking at all those other things that might need to get replaced along with the chassis. So I already knew that I was going pro touring, and I knew that I wanted to go around 600 horsepower in terms of crank output. So right then I knew that my stock 12 bolt, yeah, it probably would have been okay, but here's the problem with that. Stock 12 bolt is C-clip axle, and in corners, if you break an axle during an event, an autocross, a road course, or whatnot, there's nothing holding the axle in the axle tube anymore except if you've put disc brakes on the back. So the rotor and the disc are going to help retain that, but it's not going to hold the entire lateral load of the back end if the axle were to break in the corner. So you got to think about all these things, right? So if you're going to go pro touring, things like, yeah, do I need to get rid of those C-clips? Yes, get rid of those C-clips. Get a Mosier axle housing package or whatnot. So that all factors into this when you start going through that. You know, what kind of brakes do you want to run? Start thinking about that. Do you want big brakes? Do you want medium brakes? What are you after? And then when you're looking at all this stuff, if you're doing suspension mods and you're going to be lowering the truck, you now got to get into what's going to be happening with things like inner fenders, drive shaft tunneling because you've lowered the truck so much. You know, these are all the things that are part of that homework phase. Go read the build pages out on like 67, 72 ChevyTrucks.com. I got my build page out there for you guys to go read. There are plenty of build pages. I looked at a lot of build pages when I was building C10 CJ just to help me understand what was involved. In addition, I made tons of phone calls. You know, so when you're going through this homework, you can see down here I've got Q&A tabs for all these guys where, yeah, I mean, I had a listing of everything I wanted to ask. So I talked to No Limit, I talked to Roaster Shop, I talked to Porterbuilt. I mean, I talked to the guys that run those businesses, Rob at No Limit. I talked to, I can't even remember the guy's name, but the guy's dad from Roaster Shop that started Roaster Shop, he actually called me and talked to me. And then even at Porterbuilt, those guys. So, you know, put those lists of questions out so that when you do call them, you know, you're not just rambling on and saying, well, I think I want to run 18-inch rims or whatnot. No, have it already, you know, kind of laid out what you want because you want to be respectful of their time. These guys are very busy. You got to remember that you're one guy, they're dealing with thousands of you guys, right? So they don't have time to spend an hour on the phone with each one of you. Unfortunately, that's what it is. So that's why guys like me try to help them out. Like, if you have questions, feel free to ask me. Go onto my Facebook page, C10CJ. Send me a message through there. Go onto my build page on C10CJ on 6772 ChevyTrucks.com. Post a question there. I have no problem trying to answer and help you guys out and make any decisions because it helps to offload those guys. Because sometimes you can get frustrated with those guys if they just are too busy and they either blow you off or whatnot. You know, just things can happen. Especially if you're going to be calling in this time frame now, when we're in March right now today, this is their busy time because everybody's trying to get something together and trying to decide if they can get something built for the summer, right? So that's where this build planning is going to come in and help you because a big piece of this, and I talk about this on my build page, is lead times. So once you've figured out what all your costs are, and I'll just digress a little bit, I had engine costs in here too. I had an existing small block Chevy. I weighed, do I upgrade that? Do I go with another small block Chevy? Do I go with an LS? All those options, write them all down. Write down all those costs. Sum it all up, right? What I found out was the LS was cheaper. An all aluminum LS making 600 horsepower naturally aspirated with a forged bottom end, forged crank, rods, etc. was cheaper than the same thing in a small block Chevy. So think about that. All right, so lead times. Let's talk about lead times. That was the intro to this video, is getting boned on a lead time. Lead times are huge. You know, these guys, they don't have things sitting on the shelf. A lot of these guys, their parts are make them when you order them. So, you know, when you go to order something, they don't have anything sitting around. Some of these guys do try to build stock. Porterbuilt has been trying to build stock over the last few years, but it's difficult to judge demand because demand can go up and down. So yeah, this part of the time of year is pretty busy with demand. They're pumping out parts, but this is also when they're going to have the longest lead times because they're pumping out parts. So you have to pay attention to when you're ordering in the calendar year as well, because say like you're ordering a Porterbuilt inner frame stiffener, you go in November, might be a 2-week lead time. You go in now, March, that thing might be 8 to 12 weeks just because of the backlog that they've got. Because they have a finite set of resources, just they have a fixed number of welders and fabricators, and they can only work so much. And you guys don't like working overtime, so their guys don't like working overtime just as much as you don't like working overtime. So, that's what you're talking about, is trying to get into that queue of when those guys are making parts. So the lead time becomes pretty critical. I mean, one thing that I did that helped is in this same thing, I just had this rough little simple schedule. I threw together this example. You're going to write down all the basic steps that you're going to do. You've got, tear down, placing the order, chassis lead time. I had frame prep. At the time I was looking at just modifying the existing frame that I had. I had cab rework, which I vastly underestimated. I'll admit that up front. And then mock-up. So, when you're doing a custom build like this, you have got to expect to mock up. And I'm going to say one thing. Nothing is ever fully bolt-on. So if you're getting into where you're replacing all the suspension and you're doing some major upgrades to the vehicle that didn't come stock as from the factory like that, you're going to run into some issues. You're going to run into fitment issues if you're not careful. It's part of that homework. But even doing your homework, you're going to have fitment issues. I'll tell you one right now. You can go read about it on my build page. When I set the motor in there and I was doing some just rough measurements, I got worried that the cab was going to be too close to the driver's side valve cover. So I actually put the cab back on, not when I wanted to. I needed to put that cab back on because I was worried that I had to do more fab work on the cab than what I had planned. Turns out, yeah, I didn't have enough clearance between the valve cover and the cab to make me comfortable. So yeah, what I did was I reshaped the tunnel on C10 CJ. Very few people know that, but you guys do now. So those are the kinds of things that you also have to be prepared for. So you got to build some reserve into your schedule to try and give yourself time to deal with those unknown issues. The more stuff that you can figure out up ahead of time, the better off you'll be, but you're still going to run into issues that you just really can't predict. So that's part of the building the schedule. Now, I didn't actually do that in here, but that is something that I should have done, is do that. So, in addition, like I've got the ordering wheels in there, lead time for that, mounting and balancing, test driving, shakedown, all these kinds of things. There's a lot more steps that you can write down. If you know in your head everything you need to do, if we talk about doing a frame off, you're going to get the frame in whatever state it needs to get in so that you can start modifying it, or you're going to do what I did and buy a complete aftermarket frame. Just because you bought an aftermarket frame doesn't mean you don't have a lot of work to do. You still have brake lines, fuel lines, all that plumbing to do. I still took all the suspension off the frame and redid all the suspension. The alignment on all that stuff is your responsibilities, right? So you got to build all that into your schedule. How long does it take you to do that? If you've never done an alignment, don't think you can do it in 2 days. You're going to spend a lot of time watching YouTube videos, Googling or whatnot. That's all part of the planning process. Write that down. How many days are you going to spend doing that? Are you going to spend 2 weeks, 6 weeks, whatnot? Put all those lead times in there. Do all this before you start buying anything. Because what this will help you do is figure out when you need to buy stuff. These guys like Mark from Overhauling, they do this stuff on a regular basis. They do the build planning. They lay it out so that he knows, all right, for me to make sure that we hit this milestone of getting into the paint booth on such and such date, I need to order parts here, here, and here. Right? You don't want to order parts so far in advance that you screw yourself on the warranty. Right? If you have a 2-year build process and you buy everything up front and you don't need it for 6 months down the road or a year down the road, you've just burned up a year of that warranty time. And a lot of things, the warranty is only 1 year. So you could very well find out after you've run out of the warranty time that whatever you bought doesn't work. It has an issue, right? So that's where that helps you too, is like, don't buy stuff earlier than you actually need it. Only buy it when you need to have it with a little bit of margin on it so that you can deal with these issues of all of a sudden lead times growing. Because even when you do have known lead times, sometimes things happen. I mean, the chassis, at the time, Rob was quoting around 12 weeks. It wound up taking about 14, just because they got really busy. They had a lot going on, and I had some issues with the powder coater sending the right samples. That's the kind of stuff that you can't predict, right? I asked them to send me 3 color samples. They got 1 right. So, not the fault of No Limit. They know that's the powder coater. Whoever packaged the color samples up put the wrong color samples in the package. That's just something you have to deal with. So, you got to think about stuff like that. Like, you don't count on it, but you got to build that into your plan. You got to say, all right, that's what we call in planning world, that's called duration uncertainty for technical terms, is that if I have a 12-week task, I got something that's going to take 12 weeks, what's my uncertainty on that 12 weeks? Plus or minus 2 weeks, whatnot. So, put that 2 weeks plus in there and say, all right, instead of putting in 12 weeks for the chassis, I'm actually going to load 14 weeks so that I do wind up ordering it a little earlier, but not too much earlier or whatever. So, that's what you want to do. And if you can find some calculators to kind of rewind and go back a little bit, I even did calculations to help me do the wheel purchase. That's another one that's really difficult to do, is wheel backspace. A lot of guys struggle with the backspace, and it's not easy. So it's okay to struggle with that, because it's not an easy thing to do. There are people out there that sell tools to help you with that. If you have the axle and you have the body work and you can set the axle in the body work, you can buy this tool that allows you to mount a tire. So say you already knew the tire you wanted, which would be good. You want to figure that out. You can put the tire on this tool, stick it on the axle, and then it has ability to move the tire in and out so that you can get the backspace that you need to order. So you can set that tool up, you can measure the gaps that you have to the fender, you can see what everything looks like, that's helpful. But in some cases you don't have that, so you got to rely on calculations, which is what I did. I mean, I measured the crap out of my bed, I measured the crap out of the front end of my truck. I actually took the front end of my truck and set it up in my basement so that I couldn't do those measurements. I took a wheel and I put it down there and I said, all right, where do I want the wheel to sit in that area? And so I knew, based on the selection that I had made for the chassis before I ordered the chassis, that I had certain track widths. So, wheel mount surface to wheel mount surface. I was able to measure what where I wanted the outside of the tire, and then from there you can calculate backwards to get the offset, and once you know the offset, you can get the backspace. So that's what I did. And so when you look at my truck, if you ever have a chance to see it in person, those wheels were ordered well before I had the chassis. So I got the wheels in shortly after the chassis, but I knew that when I got the chassis, it came in a crate. I needed something to put the chassis on. So when I broke it out, I put it on jack stands originally, but then shortly after that I had the wheels mounted up and on the chassis so I could move it around. And that's another thing we'll talk about in a little bit, is shop space. But so these calculations become important, and if you struggle with it, go read the build pages, see what guys are using. I posted all my data. You got to decide, do you want the wheel to tuck? If you want the wheel to tuck, how much space do you want to allow to the fender? The one that I struggled with the most personally was the front wheel offset. These guys, Rob and so forth, will give you guidance on where to maybe start with the offset, but it's still up to you to decide what kind of offset you do. And the front is the hardest because you're talking about an A-arm suspension. As the suspension travels through, that spindle goes in an arc. and as it goes in that arc, that track width changes. It doesn't change a whole lot, but it changes. So without the chassis, you don't know where that spindle sits in that relationship. You know, if it's here, if it's up here, or if it's down here, right? That's different track widths. And it will push your tire inside or out just a little bit. So I actually got really close. The tires are a little hair in from what I want, but actually not a whole lot. Just because where I wanted it, I wanted to have the edge of the wheel go up into the deepest part of the fender without modifying anything. And it does. So that's, you know, that you just got to do all your homework. All right, so let's kind of shift gears and go into shop space. You don't need a lot of shop space to do even an entire frame off. What you do need is storage space. All right, so I did the entire C10 CJ. I did all that work in effectively a 2-car garage. And not only that, I always made sure that my wife could park in there at any time. So what I did was I built dollies for the major body parts. The cab, put that on a dolly so I could roll it around. The bed, I put that on a dolly. And I built jigs for my engine hoist. Jig to take the cab off. You know, I set up rigging to be able to move the bed around. That was key because I'll show you here. I mean, a lot of times what I did was I put the bed back on the chassis. I just lifted the bed in the dolly, set the whole bed and dolly on the chassis so that I could store it. You know, and I'd move the cab around and push that in front. You know, I had to figure it all out. But I also had the rest of the bodywork stored in my basement. So yeah, my entire front clip was downstairs in my basement. So that's what I mean by you want to have some storage space. You know, you can do everything in a 1-car garage space as long as you have storage space to put some of those body panels. So I'd say if you're going to do that kind of frame off, you want the equivalent space of a 2-car garage just so you have space to put stuff. So that is a consideration, but as part of that planning process, you know, price out even making those dollies because those dollies cost money. And if you have a fixed budget you're working from, it's a trade-off. You know, do I spend $100 to make this dolly? It'll make my life a hell of a lot easier. But I really want this thing over here that costs $100. You know, it's part of the balancing equation. You got to figure it all out. So to try and wrap this up and not keep this like super long in length, you know, do your homework first. Figure out what you want, how you want the truck to sit, what kind of wheels, tires you want. You don't necessarily need to decide the spoke. When I say wheels, tires, the big one is the diameter. Pick the diameter of the rim that you want to run. Pick the aspect ratio of the tire and the section width of the tire. That's going to define the overall diameter of the tire. That is going to be a major factor in setting your stance and where your suspension is. Once you've got that figured out, you really don't need to know the spokes, you know, what style spoke you want until you need to order the wheel. It's when you get to the point where you need to order the wheel, you need to make that decision. You know, I'll go back here in the upgrades. I cannot mention, take pictures of stuff. You know, I'm going to show you guys some stuff that I did. I took a lot of pictures. Here's a lot of the different wheel options that I looked at. Some of these guys have some simulators. That's actually not my truck. That's just a simulator that American Racing had on their website. So, yeah, so write all this stuff down, you know. Look at these wheels. I really liked some of these wheels. You know, you can see I don't have the Bose wheel in this specific sheet, but, you know, my top selection looks a lot like the Bose wheels that I want it with. I really liked these Forge Line wheels. I just didn't like the price. So, you know, look at all that stuff. I even went to the point where I started, you know, just shooting pictures of ideas of stuff that I wanted to do. What did I want the truck to look like? What kind of stance did I like? You know, here's a truck that, this was way back from C10 addiction when there was less than 1,000 of us in C10 addiction. That ought to tell you something. This truck was posted. I like the stance of this truck. You know, I did the front. I did a little higher. I didn't want the front to tuck as much as that, so I just kind of kept that in mind. You know, here's another one. I like the stance to just take the truck down another inch, and that's where C10 CJ sits, right? So get those ideas in there. Do some simulations. You know, I did some raised bed simulations. I still haven't done the bed floor, but you know, here's the bed beforehand, and here's what it looks like afterwards. So, yeah. All right. So, with that, guys, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Hope you guys found a lot of that information useful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. I'll link my build page from 6772 ChevyTrucks.com down below, and also link, you know, my Facebook page. Feel free to go there and ask me any questions. I'm open to answering questions. I try to answer them as soon as I can. If I'm busy, I will get back to you, but I'm generally, you know, within a day or two, I'll get back to you. So feel free to do that. I'm not a closed door. I'm just a DIY guy like you guys. I'm not a builder. I'm not a pro. I don't expect any money in return for that. So, all right. Well, again, thanks for watching, guys. If you liked the video, hit that like button. If you like what you saw, hit that subscribe button. I got a lot of ideas written down, so hopefully I just can get the footage shot and get the videos edited and posted, because I got a lot of stuff coming. So anyway, so if you want to see that, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in the next video. Boy, man, that was a long-winded one.